Hezbollah is burning a swath through northern Israel, and in Gaza, the war still rages on. What are the impediments to Israeli victory in this war for our national survival? I'll have the details coming up on In Focus. Over the past several days, Hezbollah has been displaying a level of capabilities that all of us feared it may achieve, but none of us quite imagined that it would come for real. And it has. So just a couple of days ago, we had massive infernos going off all over northern Israel with Hezbollah sending missiles across the border into communities, army bases, and all of the rest of it at a time when arid weather and high winds made it just a, no brainer that any small fire would become an inferno within minutes. And that's really what happened. It took the firefighters over the weekend and earlier this week several days to put out the fires. And in the meantime, Hezbollah also attacked what was supposed to be, I think, camouflaged military position in the Druze town of Khorfesh in the Galilee, in the northern Galilee, and they were able to kill one soldier who's actually being buried today by my home in Gush Etzion, and wound 7 others, including one female reservist. They were all reservists critically. So this is another thing that happened. And finally, Hezbollah announced or claims that it destroyed an Iron Dome battery in Ramat Naftali in the Golan Heights, again, displaying a level of learning and capabilities and ability to adjust to and understand Israel's operational patterns that is very, very dangerous. It also shows that actual hot war, serious war, not tit for tat that we've been seeing for the past 8 months between Israeli forces, mainly our Air Force, and Hezbollah, is now imminent. And so that's going on in the north and in the south. Like I said in the intro, the war is still raging in Rafah. They said that there may be the United States and the IDF estimate that out of a total of 35,000 or so organized forces that Hamas fielded on October 7th, somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 remain, and they think that the bulk of those forces are located in Rafah. Interesting that the United States is finally acknowledging how important and how absolutely vital it is for Israel to take over Rafah, but because of the way that the General Staff has been managing the battle, largely due to American pressure, Israel has been in more of a defensive position in the locations that it sees control over, rather than using them as a stepping off point for seizing the entire city. So according to one graphic that I saw today, Israel's in charge of about 20% of Rafah, and Hamas remains in charge. That's along the border with Egypt, and Hamas remains in charge of about 80% of Rafah, even though on the ground our operations are meeting with success and little resistance from Hamas. So the real question is, okay, so if we're now about to embark on a major operation, a war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, in order to allow the 60,000 internal refugees from the northern communities to go home at some point and go home to something as opposed to raised villages, which is what it's looking increasingly like today, we're going to have to actually carry out a battle in Lebanon, to carry the battle to Lebanon. So this is a major operation. The defense minister, Yoav Gallant, keeps threatening it, which has become really annoying. But Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Kiryat Shmona after the fires this week on Tuesday, and he said that we're getting ready for a very, very powerful operation.
בתחילת המלחמה אמרנו שאנחנו נחזיר את הביטחון הן לדרום והן לצפון, וכך נעשה. מי שחושב שהוא יפגע בנו ואנחנו נשב בחיבוק ידיים טועה טעות גדולה. אנחנו ערוכים לפעולה מאוד עצימה בצפון. בדרך זו או בדרך אחרת, אנחנו נחזיר את הביטחון לצפון.
So I'm pretty sure that this is the first time that the Prime Minister has made such a clear statement that we're going to war. And again, in the South, we were hoping that major offensive operations, particularly in Rafah, would be behind us by now. but the IDF is now estimating that it'll take several weeks until that's cleaned up. And I don't know how many weeks we have until we can dedicate a large number of forces, ground forces, to the operation in Lebanon. So, which is going to be a much, much more difficult war. And so, the question that is on a lot of people's minds right now is why it is that we've come to this point 8 months into the war and we haven't made more progress. Why is it? What are the major obstacles to progress in this war? And there are a lot of them, and I'm going to just focus on two, but a couple of them that I'm not going to focus on too much are Israel's internal politics, the legal fraternity that is insisting on approving every operation, and they are basically, incapable of making educated decisions because they don't know what the hell they're talking about because they're a bunch of lawyers, and they don't even really know international law, as we see with their ham-fisted actions vis-a-vis the ICC, the ICJ, the Americans, the international propaganda machine, etc. I'm not going to focus on them. I'm also not going to focus on Israel's domestic politics, although I'll get to that a little bit at the end. Rather, I want to focus only on two causes that are bollocksing up our war effort. The first one is the Biden administration, and I'm going to get into that. And then I want to talk about the role that the IDF Chief of General Staff and the General Staff itself are playing in undermining, to a degree, or at least mitigating, undermining is a better word, the successes on a tactical level that operational commanders on the ground in Gaza are having with their units because of hesitation and other things that we'll get into. So those are the sources of the holdup of Israel's operations and achievement of victory in Gaza, and our readiness and ability to carry out a two-front war, and our ability and readiness to actually go into Lebanon and undercut and diminish Hezbollah's massive military capability to cause strategic and perhaps even existential damage to the state of Israel. So those are the two things that I'm going to focus on. And so let's go first to the United States. So I want to play you a clip here, just a really short one, of President Biden from really just the opening days of the war.
To any country, any organization, anyone thinking of taking advantage of this situation, I have one word: don't.
So if you remember, one of the things that really sort of struck a lot of people as the testimony to the fact that President Joe Biden and his administration really were coming to the rescue of Israel after October 7th, when we were caught flat-footed and suffered the largest assault on our territory ever, that caused 1,500 people to be slaughtered, raped, etc., and kidnapped into Gaza, and thousands more to be wounded. The United States, Biden announced that he was sending an aircraft carrier to the Eastern Mediterranean. He also sent an aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf. And he came out with that statement where he said to all of the, people who might be thinking about attacking Israel, nod, nod, wink, wink, Lebanon, nod, nod, wink, wink, Iran, which controls Lebanon through Hezbollah. He says, don't. And there was some question there, was who was the don't really addressed to, because immediately after he said that, Hezbollah and Iran's proxies in Syria and in Iraq began attacking U.S. forces, and of course Hezbollah began attacking Israel, and also the Iran's Iraqi brigades and Syrian brigades were also attacking Israel with missiles. And the Houthis began their onslaught not only against shipping to Israel, but shipping in the entire Red Sea area along the Bab el-Mandab, which the Houthis, which are controlled by Iran and Yemen, control. So you have this multi-front war that opened immediately after Biden said don't. And so people like myself who were looking at that don't, and at the U.S. aircraft carrier sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean across right on the beaches, basically, of Lebanon, And I said, well, who is being deterred by this don't? Obviously, Iran is not being deterred. Obviously, its proxies in Lebanon and in Yemen and in Iraq and in Syria are not being deterred by this don't. They're attacking. They're attacking Israel. And for several months, they were attacking American forces. They killed American forces in late January, 3 of them in Jordan. So who was the don't actually directed towards? And it seemed at the time, and it seems increasingly likely today, that the don't was perhaps moving in two directions. On the one hand, of course, Hezbollah don't invade Israel. We didn't even have the forces we needed along the border with Lebanon to block an invasion. On October 7th, October 8th, I think it took around till the 9th or 10th that we were able to, scramble and get a large number of reservists to protect the border communities and also to evacuate the civilian population from the border communities that border Lebanon. They've been living in hotels ever since. So it was directed against Hezbollah, and for that it was important, but it was also directed against Israel. It was saying, Israel, don't you take this as an opportunity to diminish Hezbollah's threat. And almost immediately, President Biden's envoy to Hezbollah, Amos Hochstein, that's not his official title, but that's what he does. He arrived and he started his whole shuttle diplomacy. And it was at that time, and really since, has been geared towards appeasing Hezbollah, empowering Hezbollah. And, throughout this period, Biden has not stopped. He's allowed an increase in Iran's oil exports. He's been handing cash over to Iran in the form of billions of dollars of unfrozen assets, etc. So he's been greasing the wheels that have been funding this war against Israel all along. And it was very clear that the United States said they don't want Israel to take out Iran's, what Obama called Iran's equities in Lebanon. He does not want Israel to take any action against Hezbollah that could actually diminish their power or their control over the state of Lebanon. So that don't was heard in Jerusalem. It was not listened to. It was ignored in Beirut and in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq and, of course, in Iran. But Israel was corralled into limiting its operation in this multi-front war to a limited ground operation in Gaza after the Hamas invasion. And that was basically Biden's idea, was that he was going to isolate the major theater of operations in Gaza, constrain Israel's freedom of operation in Gaza, but through threats, through blood libels that were, deliberately starving people and all of the other things that he's been accusing us or enabling others to accuse us of all along. And so that was the plan. And then what we saw really through all of this machination on the part of the Biden administration is that while, Biden is still today pledges that his commitment to Israel's security is ironclad, that just as it was when the administration came into office in January 2021, and one of the first actions that it took was it removed the Houthis from the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations, and Robert Malley was appointed the envoy to negotiations with Iran and proceeded to beg Iran to go back to the 2015 nuclear deal that they signed with Obama. The Biden administration came into office with a policy of realigning the United States away from Israel and Saudi Arabia and towards Iran. The Biden-Obama crew that runs the Biden administration, just as it ran the Obama administration, views Iran as America's most important ally in the Middle East, never mind the fact that Iran is a sworn enemy of America and has been waging war against America since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. From the perspective of the progressive foreign policy elite that is in charge of the Biden administration, just as it was in charge of the Obama administration's foreign policy, the reason why all the problems exist in the Middle East is because the United States has been siding with Israel and the Sunnis against the Shiites. The Shiites are the authentic natives of the land, and if the United States, empower the Khomeinis, who are rightly angry at the United States because it's an imperialist power, then Iran, empowered with nuclear weapons, for instance, will bring about a balance of power with America's now spurned allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and they'll be forced to live with this, and that balance of power is going to somehow or another stabilize the Middle East. Anyway, that's the talking point that they sold, particularly during the Obama administration. The Biden administration, they've been more cagey about it. But this is clearly the policy that Biden has been implementing since taking office. He wants to empower Iran. That's why he's given them hundreds of billions of dollars, stopped enforcing the U.S. sanctions against Iran, particularly its oil and gas exports, and frozen sanctions, frozen funds of billions and billions that were frozen due to American sanctions in places like Iraq and South Korea. So that money has funded Iran's war against Israel and its nuclear program. And the Biden administration has been enabling. Why has it been enabling all of this? Because its policy is to realign the United States towards Iran. And, you'd think, right, that after October 7th in particular, the United States might reassess that policy, right, because it shattered. But that's not what happened. The Biden administration has doubled down over the past 8 months. And that's why we see this directed towards Israel. Don't go after Hezbollah, Iran's principal proxy army, most powerful proxy army that controls Lebanon. Don't go after Hezbollah. Only respond in a tit for tat. And in the meantime, during these 8 months that we haven't permitted you to go after Hezbollah, they've learned your operational patterns, and they've been able to develop the tactics required in order to cause real strategic damage to your bases and to your installations along the border. So that's what's happened because the United States has clung so tightly to its Iran-centric Middle East policy. You could add to that PLO-centric, Palestinian-centric, Palestinian state-obsessed policy. And in a way, it's a separate policy because it's more about domestic politics and appeasing the progressive base, and also the progressive base that now, mans the key positions in the Biden administration. But Iran is the main strategic focus of the administration's operations, and the Palestinian state is certainly aligned with it. So that's where the Biden administration is from a strategic outlook perspective, and how is that translated on the ground into a bollocking up, blocking, undermining, slowing down Israel's operations to the point where after 8 months we're still stuck or fighting in Gaza. We haven't defeated Hamas's military forces. They're holed up in Rafah, which the United States successfully prevented Israel from operating within for 4 months. And now continues to constrain its operations by propagating blood libels like the one last week that we killed 45 people that were killed by a secondary explosion of Hamas munitions. So they're bollocking up the operation still now. Why? Where does this also translate? So, for instance, in Lebanon, when we talk about the arms embargo that the United States has placed on 2-ton bombs, JDAM bombs, for our Air Force, you don't need 2-ton bombs in Gaza because we're not really doing a lot of bombing from the air, certainly not with that level of ordnance. We would if we were blowing up the tunnels from the sky, but because of U.S. pressure, we stopped doing that. So really that kind of ordnance, the 2-ton bombs ordinance that the United States has embargoed towards Israel, those are the bombs that Israel needs to attack Hezbollah's hardened installations in Lebanon. So that embargo was not really directed towards Israel's operation in Gaza, but rather towards Israel's ability to conduct an operation in Lebanon. And so, we're seeing northern Israel go up in flames, and the Biden administration is fine with that, which is why they're blocking Israel from receiving the munitions it needs to in order to successfully counteract Hezbollah. Why is it that Biden isn't just coming out and saying this? Well, he's not coming out and saying this for the same reason that we've been talking about for months, which is American public support for Israel, even among, base Democratic voters. They don't, even liberal Democrats generally, support Israel, and they might not support it a lot, but they support Israel. They certainly don't want Israel to be defeated by Hamas. And overall, you have, and a vast majority of independents who Biden needs in order to get reelected in November also support Israel. Republicans, he won't get no matter what, but they obviously, over 90% of them support Israel. So you have over 80% of the American population supports Israel against Hamas. And you have the 20% of Americans who comprise the Democrats' most powerful political activist base, hate Israel, hate Jews increasingly. And the Biden administration's own personnel, again, people like Hadi Amar at the State Department and Meir Bitar at the National Security Council, these are people who would be very happy if Israel was annihilated, right? And Tony Blinken is their boss, and Jake Sullivan is their boss and promotes them, and obviously sides with that because Tony Blinken's idea is, that we'll get to that in a second. So the Biden administration isn't going to say what its actual policy is, which is empowering Iran, because Americans oppose it. So instead of doing that, they sort of triangulate. They say, oh, we support Israel, and they give Israel bombs, they give Israel some stuff, but not much, and it slow walks all of this aid that then they brag about having given to Israel. At the same time, they demonize Israel. They falsely allege that we're starving the Gazans. They make this whole big demonstration of airdropping humanitarian aid into Gaza, even though it's not required, because it's all a show with them. And so that's what's happening. And even though the plan isn't working, they're doubling down because they believe in it, because they're hardened ideologues. And how do we know it's not working? So my last conversation with you, I went through Biden's speech last Friday night about the so-called ceasefire deal that Israel supposedly offered Hamas, right? That he presented as Israel's deal. And I showed play by play how this couldn't possibly have been Israel's plan. So today I'm filming, it's Thursday. And the initial reports that Hamas had rejected the deal came, I think, already on Wednesday or Tuesday night. And then Thursday, this morning, it was reported very clearly that Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's leader, says, no, we're not going to accept the ceasefire deal that the United States is offering, in exchange for some of the hostages back. Now, what happened? So Biden had this plan that was essentially going to tie Israel's hands and force Israel to accept a permanent end to the war without victory that would leave Hamas in charge of Gaza. And he did it through a lot of subterfuge in the way that he presented things, that Israel had said basically there were supposed to be three phases of a ceasefire plan, of a hostage rescue deal, of a hostages for terrorists deal. And the most important one is phase one, when you're going to get out some of the live hostages and the humanitarian release. And then the question was whether, if Hamas doesn't abide by the terms of that deal, whether Israel would go back to war or not. So Israel's position was very clearly, yes, we reserve our right to reinstate hostilities. And anyway, we're not going to end hostilities until we annihilate Hamas. That's our war goal, and we're not moving from it. So the Biden administration and President Biden, in his speech on Friday night, he said, no, we're gonna restrain Israel. We're gonna be the arbiter of whether Hamas actually abides by the deal or not. And Israel balked at that. And then when Hamas said that actually the offer that Biden outlined on Friday night was not Israel's position at all, well, Hamas rejected it, because Hamas's position since the outset of the war hasn't moved one bit. We want to kill all the Jews. We want to destroy Israel. And to that end, our specific goal here is to demand that the IDF leave Gaza completely and let us stay in charge. So that's, and then, a bunch of other stuff. Give us all our terrorists who have been convicted of murders and are sitting in Israeli prisons. Give us all back all that, and give us money, and da-da-da. And the United States was perfectly willing to do all of that, but Israel wasn't. So why did that happen? What is it? See, the problem that the Americans don't recognize is that they thought that they were going to be able to fool Hamas and Israel, that Israel and Hamas both share Biden's ideal of either reaching an end to this war, or that they're not really serious about what they're involved in. So Hamas, for instance, you can talk to Hamas because Hamas is, they did something bad on October 7th, but it was sort of a one-off, right? And now we can go back to negotiating and get to a deal, and Hamas is pragmatic, and they're going to agree that the Palestinian Authority, that the United States funds, will come in at least as at least as a fig leaf over Hamas. And so they have this whole fantasy about what Hamas actually is, and that's what they tell themselves. And Hamas is not. They are a genocidal jihadist organization that thinks that they made a lot of progress on October 7th towards achieving their goal of genocide, and they're not going to relent. Why should they? From their perspective, the longer they hold out, the more anti-Israel the world is going to become, the more Israel is going to be isolated, the more embraced they're going to become. They have every reason to believe that, so they have no reason to move from their position, since everybody, in Europe, in America, at Berkeley, at Columbia, in the White House, at the State Department, and of course at the UN and the EU, they all support Hamas's goals against Israel. Israel is now being demonized as the bad guys, and everything that Hamas is, everything that the Palestinian people believe in, that's all being ignored, and Israel is being demonized. So he's right. From their perspective, from Hamas's terror master's perspective, they have no reason to rush to anything. The world is going to give them what they want. So they have no reason to make a deal. And Israel, for its part, sees that it's in an existential war. That is, it's a war for national survival that we can't afford to lose, no matter how long it takes, so how many of our best sons we bury and daughters we bury. We have to keep going, because otherwise, nobody's going to be able to live here. If we give thousands of terrorists up to get, 30 hostages back, then basically our days are numbered as a people here, because 9 million Israelis will suddenly find themselves in a hostage situation where our children can be burned alive, our daughters can be raped, and we all of us can be slaughtered and burned alive, and they can take our children hostage, and the world will side with them. So, and we'll be stuck. So that's why Hamas won't make a deal, and that's why Israel won't make a deal, because this is a war for our survival, and this is a war from their perspective for our annihilation. And America coming in and telling itself these stories about balance of terror, balance of power, coming to an equilibrium situation with Hamas, this is shattered on the shoals of reality time after time after time. But that, of course, makes no dent in their conviction that their ideology trumps reality, and therefore we all have to accord with it, which is also what's happening in the North. Because the United States has been deterring Hezbollah all this time, supposedly in its brain, or lack of brain, in its bird brain. These fake strategists in Washington are thinking that by holding Israel back, that the United States is going to deter Hezbollah. But what they fail to recognize is the reason why Hezbollah has built up its military capabilities is to match them one-to-one to Israel's capabilities in order to be tailor-made military just for killing Jews, just for annihilating the Jewish state. Is because that's what they want to do. So it's not that you can push them 5 kilometers from the borders or 10 kilometers from the borders and get these anti-tank rockets out of range of Kiryat Shmona or Northern Command headquarters or whatever. You can't, because they've developed they've embedded within Lebanon, all over Lebanon, particularly in South Lebanon. They're not going to be moved. And they don't exist for the purpose of, bringing people a good life in Lebanon. Lebanon defaulted on its debt last year. I mean, it's totally bankrupt. Nobody has any money. It's an indigent country that's only been saved by this war. So, and it's saved by every war that it carries out against Israel. So they're not going anywhere. And the Americans refuse to see this. So they've been blocking Israeli victory. They've been slowing down Israeli victory. The good thing about that is that what we saw with Rafah, and even with the announcement this morning that the Americans acknowledge that, the bulk of Hamas's forces that still have to be destroyed are located in Rafah, is that, here Israel defied, Prime Minister Netanyahu defied President Biden, who said, don't, right, in terms of going into Rafah. He went into Rafah. And the Americans are grudgingly accepting this state of affairs, and they're not stopping Israel's operation in Rafah. So, they're curtailing it, so you can only use 1 division, not 2, which is a problem we'll get to shortly, and other things to try to undermine the operation. But at the end of the day, here we have an acknowledgement that the bulk of Hamas's forces that still have to be destroyed are in Rafah. So I think that's very important, because we've learned that, yes, we can defy Biden's determination that we lose this war, but that brings us to the second side of this debate, which is the second actor that's slowing down Israel's advances in this war and serving as an obstacle to victory, whether in Gaza or in Lebanon. And that is, unfortunately, the IDF General Staff. And, this isn't for people who have been paying attention, people who have been listening to me, you guys, since October 7th. It's not that big of a surprise because, we've seen on October 7th, in the hours before the Hamas invasion, at 12 o'clock at night, at midnight, and then again at 4 o'clock in the morning, the Chief of General Staff, Lieutenant General Herzl Halevi, had conference calls with the commander of Southern Command, with representative of the Intelligence Directorate, the head of the Intelligence Service, Aaron Khaliwa, was indisposed, doing something or another on vacation in Eilat, and the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. They were on this conversation, and they talked about the fact that Hamas was making movements indicating that something was about to happen, that Israel may be invaded. And Herzl Halevi opted in both of those conversations at 6 in the morning or 4 in the morning, 2.5 hours before the invasion, and at 12 midnight, 6.5 hours before the invasion, not to raise the level of readiness of the forces on the ground, not to augment the forces across the border, not to alert the commander of the Air Force, not to alert Gaza Division Chief, not to alert any of the relevant forces that Hamas may well be planning an invasion and that they had to be ready or help them to be ready. And the other actor that he didn't inform was the political leadership of Israel. He did not inform either Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of what was happening, and he certainly did not inform Prime Minister Netanyahu. The first Netanyahu heard about Hamas's intended invasion was after it had begun at 6:29 in the morning. So we already know that. We know that the IDF, over a year before the Hamas invasion, received the detailed plans of Hamas's invasion, and Khalifa and other senior commanders completely dismissed it. The operations directorate leader in the IDF had received warnings from the Southern Command about Hamas's preparations, and the official position of Southern Command that the Nova Music Festival, for instance, shouldn't be allowed to take place. And that position of Southern Command was overruled by the head of the operations directorate in the IDF. So we have all of this stuff that we know. And then you have several of the senior officers in the IDF, particularly Khaliwa, well, three actually. It's Khaliwa, the head of Intel, who just resigned, and Herzl Halevi, the chief of general staff, and Ronen Bar, the head of Shin Bet, who all three said that they accept their responsibility for October 7th, but then they didn't resign and they maintained their position. Khaliwa just resigned a month and a half ago, and Herzl Halevi replaced them with Brigadier General, now Major General Binder, who was the head of operations in the general staff on October 7th, and he ostensibly was the one who gave permission for the Nova Music Festival to take place against the warnings of his counterpart in the Southern Division. So he is also part of the problem, and he was just brought in to replace Khaliwa, who was definitely part of the problem. So that's what's happening with the general staff, and Ronen Bar as well. He knew what was going on. He didn't alert his people. He didn't give them orders to be ready to fight. He sent in a very small force to the south to extricate, as it were, senior Shin Bet officers, not to help in the fighting. A lot of them were killed in the end, but that was his goal. It was to extricate his own people who were living along the border with Gaza, and not to protect the people who were slaughtered that morning. So this was a major failure. They all said we're responsible, and then proceeded to remain responsible going on. So this past week, we've gotten 3 stories that indicate that their failure on October 7th didn't teach them any lessons. That is, that they're maintaining the same pattern of behavior today that they had in October 7th, in terms of not suing for victory, not fighting to victory, not taking the enemy seriously enough, and then also not informing the political leadership of what's going on. So here I'm just going to give you the 3 stories that came out this week. So first of all, I think it was this morning, Yediot Ahronot and Ynet published an interview with a colonel, a reserve colonel named Chezi Nechama. Chezi Nechama is a former commander of the Givati reconnaissance unit and an officer in the Sayeret Matkala reconnaissance unit and others. He has been mobilized since October 7th. He was in Gaza as an advisor to one of the battalion commanders, and later as I think an operations officer in one of the divisions. So he has taken over a new program that the IDF had to open, which is officer training course for reservists, because we've lost so many officers, so we have to train reservist officers to take their roles. So he's actually just graduated the second course of reserve officers that has opened up since October 7th. And he gave this interview to Yediot Ahronot, and he pointed an accusatory finger that's very serious at the general staff. And I'm just going to give you a quote of what he said, that the directions that the IDF is going are not going to bring us victory. He said the IDF is carrying out attacks without maintaining a continuation of operations or a concentration of forces, so that we're not focused on any one thing. We start something, we take over Khan Yunis, and then we leave Khan Yunis, and nothing that we've done is maintained, because we leave as soon as we've achieved an operational level of control, and then as soon as we've gotten it, we leave, and then Hamas comes back in, and then we have to attack, and that's why we're going back into a lot of the areas in northern Gaza and having major operations in areas that we thought that we had already won. It's because the general staff keeps ordering the forces to leave the areas that they've just, at great cost, seized control over. So that's that, and it says the IDF is not going in and doing house-to-house liquidation of enemy forces in areas that it's already seized control over, and instead it leaves these areas very quickly, which is what allows the enemy to go back and to continue fighting in a way that's really challenging the IDF the next time around. And so we're just scoring points. We're not actually defeating the enemy. It's like a whack-a-mole thing, which is stupid because there's no reason for that to happen. So he's saying that the IDF general staff is taking every tactical achievement that the IDF scores and squandering it by pulling out the forces as soon as they've done it. He also said that in Rafah specifically, we've taken over the border zone, most of it with Egypt. We still, for whatever reason, haven't taken over the last 2 kilometers of the border zone, which is basically leaving the barn door open for no particular reason. And that then once we've seized these areas along the Egyptian border, we haven't used them as then stepping off positions to go into the rest of Rafah and take over the rest of the city from Hamas. So we're in this weird situation where he said that even in the middle of operations, you're in the middle of an operation and the general staff comes to you and says, you got to stop. Why? Because the Americans oppose it. So it's like the general staff is working hand in glove with the Biden administration to undermine operations as they're carried out. So our general staff generals are taking their directions not from Netanyahu and from Gallant, who they're not even informing about what's happening, as they didn't inform on the night of October 6th, 7th. They're taking the directions from a foreign power, from the United States, who's getting into the thought loop. And I've spoken about this in the past, and maybe I have to find time to do an entire show about how you have people in the State Department and the Pentagon who are actually calling directly IDF general staff officers on the ground and bothering them in the middle of their operation. So that's one of the things that, we're going to have to discuss at another time. But then the second story was that Herzi Halevi told Major General Sa'ar Sur, he's the commander of the northern, the northern column, which is like the second level underneath the general officer commanding the northern command. So he told this major general, who's a member of the general staff, that he wasn't going to be promoted, and basically that he's cashiering and he's going to be sent out of the government. So This was supposedly a meeting just between the two of them that was leaked as well to Yediot Ahronot, and Tzur essentially said to Halevi, "Who the hell are you to fire me?" And he said, this is what he says. He said to him, "What about everybody else?" Well, he said, "Wait a minute, I'm the one who failed. I have to go." He said, "There are a lot of people who are responsible for what happened on October 7th, and they're still in their positions." He said, and the chief of staff said, "Well, the head of intelligence, Khaliwa, has resigned." And he said, "Well, what about everybody else? What about the Southern Command commander? What about you?" That's what he said to him. "What about everybody else? What about the head of operations? Why are you guys still here? Why do I have to leave? I didn't do anything that led to October 7th. You're directly responsible." In so many words, that's what he said to him. And what it shows is that you have increasing levels of lack of confidence. And so Nechama is part of this group of reserve officers, and they're coming to Halevi, and they've been trying to tell him, "Look, you have to change your operational structure. You have to change it. You have to stop this. You have to stop interfering with operations on the ground." And he's refused to meet with them. They've set up 3 meetings with him, and he's canceled all of them. So finally, they decided to go public with what they're saying because they don't have any other outlet. So they're going to be holding a big conference, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of combat commanders in reserves that are going to be doing this public conference against the chief of staff and the general staff for what they view as their role in undermining the war. So that's actually pretty unbelievable, right? So we're looking at that. That's from the operational level, and then Tzur and his conversation with Herzi Halevi is just yet another intimation of the fact that there's no confidence from the operational level in the general staff. And that's something that can't go on. And then finally, this week, we had an excerpt from a book that just came out this week about Israel's ruling class by Ido Norden, who's a major in reserves. And he gave a story in this where he said that he was in the command post of the Kiryat during the first weeks of the war. And during that period, the first week of the war, right after October 7th, you had a division commander and the Air Force and other operational leaders had put together a rescue operation because we knew that there were hostages that were being held in Shifa Hospital. And they intended to carry out a rescue operation with the Naval SEALs to get to Shifa Hospital and to rescue whomever among the hostages was still located there. And most of them were apparently, or many, many of them were. And they were working on this operation around the clock, and Herzi Halevi rejected it. He refused to approve the operation when it was presented to him. And not only did he do that, but the same man, the same IDF chief of general staff that did not tell Netanyahu or Gallant on the night of the 6th, 7th of October in the early morning hours about what was happening in Gaza and the indications that Hamas was about to invade, he also didn't inform them that his own officers had put together a plan to rescue the hostages at Shifa Hospital. And this was, again, in the days after October 7th. So he blocked that from happening. So these 3 stories that have come out this week, I think they tell a very important story, and that story is that it's not just people like, right-wing commentators like myself who are looking at the general staff and say, what are these people still doing here? For a long time, there was an attempt to paper it over and say, no, now they've woken up and now they're really going to get with a victory issue and stuff. And it's very clear after 8 months that's not what happened, that the people who failed us on October 7th are incapable of fixing what they broke. And so they have to be gotten rid of. And the fact that you're having this apparent insubordination of the operational level shows just how critical the situation has become. And when you look at the imminent war that we're facing in the North, because there's no other way of doing it, it's obvious that things are going to happen. So I guess, there are the political thing, part of the reason that the IDF general staff has been protected is because their colleague and former commander, Benny Gantz, is one of the key members of the war cabinet. He came in on October 7th, and he is apparently going to leave the government. He made an ultimatum for June 8th, and so he may leave today, the 6th, tomorrow, the 7th, the 8th, whatever. So he may be leaving, and if he leaves, he's their main protector in the war cabinet. gives the prime minister more power. We'll see. But it's also that it's coming up from the surface. So that even if the prime minister feels like he can't fire Herzl Levy, I think that the pressure coming up from the operational level is going to force him out. And it may enable I think what happens basically, and the reason why I want to end on an optimistic note is that even though it's really horrible and we're paying a huge price because for 8 months, the same people who brought us this colossal failure on October 7th are in charge. Same people who were listening to the Americans before October 7th as the United States was moving assiduously towards realigning the United States away from Israel and the Sunnis and towards Iran are still doing that and are still heeding all of the orders that they're receiving from the United States, again, behind the back apparently of the government and against the operational logic of the operations that are being carried out in Gaza, that they're going to be forced to leave because, you can't really operate in an atmosphere where it's clear that the people under you don't have confidence in you, that the public doesn't trust you, and that the government doesn't trust you. So even if the government is weak vis-a-vis the general staff, it's not weak vis-a-vis the public and the operational levels of command of the IDF. And so that's something, that's happening. And why is all of this going to happen? For the same reason that the Biden administration's attempt to entrap Israel in this fake deal that was going to bring strategic victory to Hamas couldn't work, because what's at stake here is not, a soundbite. It's not an opinion poll in the United States. It's not what's going to happen on the South Lawn of Columbia University or at Harvard Yard. It's not stuff that is valued by the vacuous progressives who are running U.S. foreign policy under the Biden administration. What's the rationales that are determining the course of events on the ground in the Middle East are Israel's determination not to be annihilated and Iran and its proxies' determination to annihilate Israel, so that either Israel succeeds in surviving by defeating these people, at least enough in order to breathe without fear for the next year or two, or all of us are dead because they've killed us all, because that's what they want. So those are the two options that we're facing. Going forward. And nothing that the Biden administration does to obfuscate that, and nothing that our failed generals do to try to get around that somehow are going to work. So the reality of the situation, the gravity of the situation has to come. It has to be exposed. And the actors who are trying to deny it are going to have to act in accordance with reality, because reality at the end of the day does trump their ideology or their organizational interests in the IDF general staff. So that's where I think we are today. And obviously we'll have more maybe next time. Like I said, Gantz won't be in the government anymore, and we'll talk about it then. Anyway, take care and have a great weekend. See you soon.